When ancient people lifted stones weighing tens of tons, carved channels through dry deserts, watched the slow dance of the stars, and recorded the passing of time, it felt to them as if they were building something eternal. Their cities were protected by the gods. Their laws were illuminated by the sky. Their order felt like the only possible way the world could exist. They did not doubt the future. They believed the universe was balanced, meaningful, and stable. And yet, today, all that remains of those worlds are ruins beneath the sand, fragments of myths, strange symbols, and unanswered questions that still whisper through time. What went wrong? Why did civilizations so different in culture, belief, and technology vanish through such eerily similar patterns? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why do these patterns repeat again and again? Welcome, my dear friends, to the official ASMR Dreams channel. This is a place where sleep gently meets knowledge, where a soft voice carries you through the night like a quiet tide. Tonight, we begin a journey along the traces of the 25 most mysterious civilizations of the ancient world. Those who first mastered stone, water, and time. Those who built megacities without modern tools, created vast religious systems, governed enormous territories, and left behind puzzles that even today remain unsolved. Here you will discover cities that vanished without war, cultures whose writing we still cannot read, and societies whose influence outlived their own people. Thank you for your warmth in the comments, and a special thank you to our sponsors, and to everyone who supports the channel through Super Thanks. Your kindness helps this space grow and brings quiet joy to its creator. And now, before sleep fully embraces you, please subscribe to the channel. Settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let us begin. Chapter 1. What do we mean when we say civilization? The word civilization sounds as though its meaning is obvious, as if it needs no explanation at all. We say it calmly and confidently. Cities, temples, writing, laws, technologies. The list seems simple, but step just a little deeper into history, and that certainty begins to crumble, like dry clay in the hands of an archaeologist. For a long time, a civilization was defined only as a society that left behind stone cities, written texts, palaces, and centralized power. Everything else was pushed aside. Nomadic peoples, hunter-gatherers, cultures without writing or monuments were labeled primitive, not because they were inferior, but because they did not fit into a later invented story of progress. Yet archaeology does not read textbooks. With every decade, discoveries grew and easy answers disappeared. We learned that complex societies can exist without kings, that large-scale cooperation can happen without armies, that religion, art, and symbolic thought can arise long before farming or permanent settlements, and that the absence of writing does not mean the absence of knowledge. Civilization is no longer a ladder. It is a web of paths spreading in every direction. Some societies built cities. Others built temples. Some developed mathematics and astronomy. Others created rich oral traditions and ritual systems just as complex, though far harder to preserve. Even nomadic cultures, once dismissed, are now seen differently. Mobility was not weakness. It was another form of order. Some of these cultures possessed extraordinary systems of navigation, ecology, memory, and shared knowledge. Their cities were not made of stone, but of time. Modern archaeology now views civilization not as a final product, but as a living process, a way humans relate to one another, to nature, and to the meaning of the world itself. It may be monumental or nearly invisible. It may expand endlessly or exist in fragile balance with its environment. And no single path is the correct one. We also tend to believe that civilizations disappear only when they fail. But history tells a gentler truth. Sometimes disappearance is transformation, sometimes migration, sometimes quiet merging into something new. People leave cities not because they collapse, but because the world around them changes faster than the structures they built. A civilization does not always die. Sometimes it simply becomes unrecognizable. And that is why the story of lost civilizations is not about defeat. It is about resilience, adaptation, and the fragile balance between permanence and change. Chapter 2. Göbekli Tepe. Religion before cities. Until very recently, human history seemed beautifully simple. First hunting and gathering, then farming, then villages, then cities, then temples, and finally civilization. A neat, comforting chain. And then archaeology quietly broke it. In southeastern Turkey, beneath a forgotten hill, something was found that should not have existed. It is over 11,000 years old, a time when humans were believed to have only temporary shelters, no stable communities, no organization capable of building anything monumental. And yet, here stood massive stone circles, towering pillars carved with precision and intention. Stones weighing tens of tons were quarried, shaped, transported, and raised by people who supposedly had no metal, no wheels, no animals, only human hands, shared purpose, and astonishing understanding. This was not a place to live. No cooking, no homes, no children. It was a place to come to, a place of ritual, of gathering, of repeating actions whose meanings are now almost lost. The pillars are carved with predators, snakes, birds, and mysterious symbols. These animals are not prey. They are forces. Powerful, dangerous, sacred. Everything here speaks not of survival, but of worldview. And the most unsettling implication is this. To build Göbekli Tepe, people had to plan, cooperate, return again and again. They had to organize themselves long before farming existed. So what if the first human structures were not economic, but spiritual? What if ritual came before agriculture? One hypothesis suggests that shared ceremonies drew people together, and feeding large groups required stability, and stability led to farming. In this view, culture did not emerge from survival. Survival changed because of meaning. But perhaps the greatest mystery is how it ended. After centuries of use, the people of Göbekli Tepe did not destroy it. They did not abandon it in chaos. They buried it, carefully, deliberately, layer by layer, as if someone gently closed a book that was never meant to be opened again. Why this happened, no one truly knows. Perhaps their beliefs changed. Perhaps the old symbols became dangerous. Or perhaps the very form of collective life quietly transformed into something new. Göbekli Tepe does not tell us a story in a clear voice. It asks questions. It shows us that civilization may begin not with houses and fields, but with myths and rituals. That people were willing to invest enormous effort, not just to survive, but to honor what they believed was meaningful and sacred. And that human history is far older and far more intricate than we once imagined. After this discovery, one thing becomes clear. The path of civilizations was never a straight line. It did not begin where we expected it to. And ahead of us lie societies that will again and again reshape everything we think we know about how humans became human. Chapter 3. The Indus Valley Civilization. Order without power. When archaeologists first uncovered the cities of the Indus Valley, they expected the familiar scenery of the ancient world. Palaces of kings, towering temples, colossal statues of gods, tombs of elites. But instead, they found something far stranger, and in a quiet way, far more unsettling. This civilization existed over 4,000 years ago in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. It was vast, hundreds of settlements, dozens of large cities, uniform building standards across thousands of kilometers. And yet, not a single palace, not a single obvious temple, no royal tombs, no portraits of rulers. The cities of the Indus were planned with a calm, almost modern logic. Straight streets crossing at right angles, neighborhoods of equal size, houses built from standardized bricks, as if from a shared architectural code. Every home had access to wells, drainage systems, carefully designed sewers, some more advanced than those of European cities in the Middle Ages. But the most striking thing was not the technology. It was the feeling of order. Not an order imposed by force, not one proclaimed through monuments, but one woven quietly into everyday life. So who ruled this world? We do not know the names of any kings, perhaps because there were none. There are no signs of large armies, no fortified walls for major wars, no scenes of conquest. Even weapons are rare. Instead of power, we see agreement. Instead of hierarchy, coordination. Instead of a cult of rulers, a cult of order. Their writing deepens the mystery. Short inscriptions on seals, pottery, copper plates. Hundreds of symbols in repeating patterns. Clearly a language. Clearly important. And yet, completely unread. We do not know if they recorded names, prayers, laws, or trade. Their voices are silent. We can see how they lived, but we cannot hear how they thought. And then they simply faded. The cities were not destroyed. No enemy burned them. No layers of ash or bones. People just began to leave, slowly, settlement by settlement. Drains fell silent. Streets emptied. Bricks became rougher. The perfect order dissolved, not in a catastrophe, but in a whisper. Why? Climate change, drying rivers, floods, trade collapse, pressure from outside, all possible, none complete. Perhaps the system itself simply could not adapt. The Indus Valley civilization shows us something rare, a society that seemed to thrive without visible power, without monuments to ego, without endless war. And yet, even this quiet harmony was not eternal. Sometimes disappearance does not look like tragedy. Sometimes it looks like fading. They did not fall, they dissolved. And they took their language, their memories, and their understanding of the world with them, leaving us with silent cities and an unanswered question. Can a society exist without power? And if so, for how long? Chapter 4, The Sumerians. When history suddenly began, if human history is a long river, the Sumerians appear like a sudden waterfall. Before them, scattered villages, simple tools, slow change. And then, almost without warning, a world with writing, mathematics, laws, cities, temples, professions, and a sense of time itself. It was as if someone suddenly turned the complexity of the world all the way up. They arose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a harsh land of floods and droughts where survival was never easy. Almost fully formed, they did not slowly learn to write, they invented it. Wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay recorded debts, names, prayers, hymns. For the first time, the past could be preserved, not just remembered. Before Sumer, history lived in memory. With them, it became written. They divided time the way we still do today. The year into months, the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes. We are still living inside Sumerian time, even now. Then the Sumerian language faded from daily speech, replaced by Akkadian. Their knowledge was preserved in the libraries of new empires. Even when the Sumerians no longer existed as a people, they lived on as an idea, as the foundation upon which Babylon, Assyria, and the entire ancient Near East were built. They are one of the rare civilizations that did not die, but dissolved, physically gone, yet conceptually everywhere, in our calendars, in our way of counting time, in the very logic of how society is organized. It ended by becoming too important to vanish. It stopped being itself. Chapter 5. The Maya. Intelligence at the edge of survival, the Maya civilization leaves behind a strange and almost unsettling feeling. The more we learn about it, the harder it becomes to believe it could have fallen. They measured time with haunting precision. They tracked the movement of planets. It feels as if such a world should never have collapsed. These were not random settlements. They were aligned with the sky. The placement of stairways, plazas, and buildings often matched the positions of the sun, moon, and Venus on sacred days of the year. For the Maya, time was alive. They developed multiple calendars. They were a web of city-states, linked by trade, war, marriages, and rivalry. Each city was its own living being, with its own gods and ambitions. And this was both their strength and their weakness. As the system grew more complex, it demanded more and more from the land. Populations grew. Cities became dependent on stable harvests. Dates were no longer carved. Temples were left unfinished. Centers of power grew silent. And again, what did not happen is just as important. There was no great invasion, no blanket of ash, no single cataclysm. The Maya were not destroyed. They walked away. Research now points to a convergence of forces: long droughts caused by climate change, ecological strain, political instability from endless wars. The system was too intelligent, too intricate, and too fragile. They could predict the heavens, but not preserve the soil. They could measure time, but not slow its pressure. And yet the Maya did not vanish completely. Their descendants still live. Their languages, traditions, and worldviews endure. The cities fell. The elite culture faded. But the people remained. The Maya teach us something essential. The collapse of a civilization is not always the end of a people. Sometimes it is a retreat, a step back from complexity in order to survive. Chapter 6. Rapa Nui, an island as a closed world. Some civilizations feel like warnings, not myths, not metaphors, but experiments performed by nature itself. Rapa Nui, Easter Island, is one of them. A tiny island in the vast Pacific, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest land, became the stage for a drama that reflects all of humanity. Polynesians arrived here in fragile boats, navigating by stars, currents, and memory. Even reaching the island was an astonishing act of knowledge and courage. They came to a world with limits: limited land, limited forests, limited animals, limited space. And here they created one of the most mysterious cultures on Earth. Its symbol was the moai, giant stone statues with massive heads, hundreds of them, carved from volcanic rock, transported for kilometers, raised on platforms along the coast. Each one represented an ancestor, a source of spiritual power, watching not the ocean, but the people themselves. But the cost was immense. Trees were cut, ropes were made, soil was disturbed, and slowly the forests vanished. Without trees, boats could no longer be built. Every mistake multiplied. Fish became scarce. Harvests declined. Conflicts grew. Statues were toppled. War erupted. Hunger spread. Step by step, without ever fully realizing the scale of the consequences. Eventually becomes deadly. This tiny island became a miniature model of the entire planet. Limited resources, growing ambitions, a deep confidence that catastrophe is impossible, right until the very last moment. And after this story, one truth becomes clear. Not all civilizations vanished because of an external blow. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is success, trapped inside closed boundaries. And ahead of us now waits a society that chose the opposite path, a world without walls, open to sea and wind, yet unable to survive a chain of disasters. Chapter 7. The Minoan Civilization, a world without walls. If a traveler from the ancient world had arrived on Crete in the second millennium BCE, he would have been puzzled. Where were the fortresses? Where were the towering defensive walls? They were not there. Minoan cities were open. Their palaces, complex, multi-layered, filled with light and air, had no fortifications at all. It was as if their builders could not imagine that the world might come with a sword. The Minoan civilization grew on an island that seemed almost designed for maritime power. Crete lies at the crossroads between Egypt, Asia Minor, and mainland Greece. And the Minoans used this perfectly. They became a naval power long before classical fleets ever existed. Their ships crossed the eastern Mediterranean, trading, sharing ideas, technologies, and symbols. The sea was their road, their wall, and their source of strength. At the heart of the Minoan world stood the palaces, above all, Knossos. But the word palace is misleading. These were not merely royal residences. They were administrative, religious, and economic centers all at once. A labyrinth of corridors, storerooms, workshops, shrines. Everything was organized with great complexity, yet without loud displays of power. Authority here did not shout. It dissolved into the system itself. Minoan culture is striking for its visual lightness. Frescoes show dancing figures, acrobats, leaps over bulls, waves, and dolphins. There are almost no scenes of war, almost no depictions of violence. This is extraordinarily rare in the ancient world, where art so often glorified conquest. Here, instead, art spoke of movement, of the body, of celebration and rhythm. It feels as though the civilization itself was tuned to harmony rather than conflict. Their religion was different too. Instead of harsh, dominating gods, they revered the forces of nature, female deities, symbols of fertility, snakes, mountains, caves. The sacred was everywhere, but it was not locked into a single rigid doctrine. Order was maintained not by fear, but by habit, by shared meaning. And yet, this very openness made the Minoans vulnerable. Around the middle of the second millennium BCE, a chain of disasters began to shake this seemingly stable world. A massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, became one of the greatest natural catastrophes of antiquity. Earthquakes, tsunamis, clouds of ash. Trade routes were broken. Ports were destroyed. An economy tied to the sea began to falter. The Minoans did not vanish immediately. Their culture survived for some time, weakened, but still alive. And then new forces appeared. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, more warlike, more rigid, accustomed to fortifications and conquest. Crete was too open for this new world. The Minoan civilization did not fall in a single battle. It was not wiped from the earth. It was absorbed. Palaces were destroyed and rebuilt. Writing systems faded. Languages changed. Culture dissolved into a new reality, leaving behind only images, myths, and echoes. Even the legend of the Minotaur and the labyrinth is more than a story. It is a memory of complex palaces, of mysterious power, and of a world that was both too intricate and too open. The Minoans teach us that a civilization can perish not from cruelty or error, but from its own belief in the stability of the world. They lived as if walls were unnecessary, and perhaps, in their time, they truly were. But history rarely forgives long-lasting openness. After the Minoans, the Mediterranean would become more violent, more rigid, more closed. Chapter 8. Norte Chico, the Pyramids Without War. When people think of the first civilizations of the Americas, their minds usually travel to the Maya, the Aztecs, or the Inca, but thousands of years before them, on the Pacific coast of what is now Peru, there existed a world that breaks almost every expectation of what an ancient civilization should be. Norte Chico is one of the most mysterious cultures of antiquity, and perhaps the oldest known civilization of the New World. It is more than 5,000 years old, a contemporary of early Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet shaped by a completely different historical path. Here, they built pyramids, large, monumental, visible from far away. Not one or two, but dozens. They rose above river valleys, forming complex ritual centers. And when archaeologists studied these places, they found something deeply unexpected. There were no signs of war, no fortifications, no weapons, no mass graves of violence. In Norte Chico culture, images of conflict are almost entirely absent. No battle scenes, no warriors, no displays of force. Even pottery, so common in most ancient societies, was barely used here. This society seemed to have chosen a different path. Its economy was based on a delicate balance between sea and land. Fish and seafood from the coast, combined with crops from the river valleys, not for conquest, not for empire, but for stability. This system required coordination, planning, and trust between communities, and for a long time, it worked. The centers of Norte Chico were not cities in the usual sense. They were nodes of ritual life, places of gathering, ceremony, and collective action. People came not to live, but to participate in building, in worship, in maintaining a shared order. There was a social structure, but it did not express itself through the usual symbols of power. This confronts history with an uncomfortable question. Is a complex society possible without constant violence? Without an army as the foundation of order? North Chico seems to answer, yes, but not forever. The reasons for its decline remain unclear. There is no evidence of massive earthquakes, no obvious climate catastrophe, no signs of conquest. The settlements simply began to empty. People left quietly, leaving behind pyramids that no one remained to maintain. Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps the fragile balance between sea and land was broken. Or perhaps the very form of social organization could no longer adapt. A civilization built on agreement and ritual may have been too sensitive to a shifting world, and so it faded, not in flames, but in silence. North Chico is a quiet reminder that the path of civilization does not have to pass through war and conquest, but it is also a reminder that the absence of violence does not make a society immortal. Even the most peaceful structures can vanish. If their inner balance is broken, they fade. Those pyramids were not destroyed. They were not toppled by enemies. They were simply left behind, silent witnesses of a society that chose a different path and still could not remain in time. And after North Chico, one thing becomes clear. Civilizations do not always disappear because they were cruel. Sometimes they vanish because they were too delicately tuned. And now, ahead of us, waits the story of a people who left no cities in the usual sense, but left homes carved directly into stone, and then walked away as if they melted into the landscape itself. Chapter 9. The Anasazi, the civilization that walked away in the history of the ancient world. Few disappearances feel as quiet and at the same time as unsettling as the fate of the Anasazi. They left no burned ruins. They were not erased by conquerors. They did not vanish in a single catastrophe. They simply left. Homes carved into cliffs, granaries, roads, traces of daily life, as if people had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The Anasazi, today more often called the ancestral Pueblo, lived in the American Southwest, a region where nature itself feels like a test. Desert, sharp temperature changes, sparse rainfall, and yet here they created a stable society that lasted for centuries. Their cities did not rise upward like in so many other civilizations. They grew into the rock. The cliff dwellings of the Anasazi still astonish modern observers. Homes like honeycombs embedded in sheer canyon walls, multi-story complexes linked by ladders and passageways. These were not primitive shelters. They were carefully designed living spaces, protected from heat, from cold, and from external danger. Height and inaccessibility made these cities almost impossible to attack. But the Anasazi were not only architects. They were listeners to the land. They grew corn, beans, and squash. They built systems to collect rainwater. They watched the sun and the seasons. Many of their settlements are aligned with solstices and equinoxes. In this world, knowledge of nature was not philosophy. It was survival. And yet, around the end of the 10th century, something began to change. The climate grew drier. Droughts became more frequent. Harvests shrank. Pressure on resources increased. Archaeological evidence shows declining nutrition, rising tension between communities, and stronger defensive features in later settlements. But despite this, the Anasazi did not fight a massive war for the land. They chose something else. They began to leave. Settlements were abandoned in an organized way. Valuable items were taken. There are no signs of panic, no traces of chaotic flight. This was not collapse. It was a decision. People left familiar places and moved to new regions where conditions were more forgiving. Their culture did not disappear. it changed form. Modern Pueblo peoples see themselves as direct descendants of the Anasazi. Their myths, rituals, and traditions preserve the memory of a long journey, of changing lands and leaving old homes behind. For them, this is not a tragedy. It is part of the cycle of life. The world changes, and humans must change with it. The Anasazi show us a rare kind of civilizational flexibility. When the environment no longer supported their old way of life, they did not cling to it at any cost. They did not cling to stone and walls. They chose movement over destruction. That is why their disappearance feels so strange. We are used to seeing civilizations die because they could not change. The Anasazi left because they could. And perhaps this is one of the most important lessons of the ancient world. Sometimes it is not the one who builds the strongest cities who survives, but the one who knows when it is time to walk away from them. And after this story, we turn to a civilization that left behind massive stone symbols, but not even its own name. Chapter 10, the Olmecs, the nameless founders. In the history of ancient civilizations, some peoples left behind the names of kings, texts, chronicles, and dates, and others left only stone, silent, heavy, unmoving. The Olmecs belong to this second kind. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know the names of their rulers or gods. And yet, they became the foundation of almost all later Mesoamerican civilization. The Olmecs appeared more than 3,000 years ago along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in a world of humid jungles, rivers, and swamps. This is one of the worst environments for preserving the past. Stony roads, wood rots, bones disappear. And yet here, a culture emerged whose influence spread across vast regions and outlived its creators. The most recognizable legacy of the Olmecs is their colossal stone heads. Their faces are unmistakable. Massive features, helmets, a focused, almost stern gaze. Some of these sculptures stand over 3 meters tall and weigh tens of tons. The stone was transported for many kilometers through jungles, rivers, and swamps, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. And here, archaeology keeps asking the same quiet question: why? These heads were not simple decorations. They were not always displayed in public. Many have been found buried, moved, and reinstalled. They are thought to be portraits of rulers or elites, but no theory fully explains them. They are not just monuments. They are symbols of power, of memory, and perhaps of sacred presence. Stone faces meant to watch the world, even after the people were gone. The Olmecs created an entire complex of ideas that later became the foundation for other civilizations. Ritual centers with platforms and pyramids. A complex religious system filled with hybrid beings, half human, half animal. The cult of the jaguar. Symbols of power tied to the cosmos and the underworld. All of this later appears among the Maya, the Zapotecs, the Aztecs, but it first emerged here. And yet, the Olmecs seem not to have had a fully developed writing system. If signs existed, they never became a stable way to transmit knowledge. This means their entire intricate system of belief, ritual, and authority was passed down orally, through ceremony, imagery, and tradition. And that made it especially fragile. The disappearance of the Olmecs remains a mystery. There is no evidence of massive war, no clear sign of a great catastrophe. Their centers simply declined. People left them, blending into new cultures. Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps trade routes broke down. Or perhaps their role was always different. Not to build an eternal empire, but to lay a foundation. The Olmecs seem to have completed their task and then faded, leaving behind not a text, but a template, architectural, religious, symbolic. Their ideas lived on in other peoples, long after the Olmecs themselves ceased to exist as a distinct culture. That is what makes them so important. They show us that the influence of a civilization is not always measured by how long it lasts or how many records survive. Sometimes it is enough to shape the world and then quietly step away after them, Mesoamerica was never the same. And ahead of us waits a civilization whose existence still balances between myth and history, one that may never have existed in quite the way we imagine it. Chapter 11. Atlantis. A myth as a warning. There are civilizations we know too little about. And then there is one we seem to know too much about, even though it may never have existed at all. Atlantis holds a special place in human memory. It is not just a lost city or a vanished people. It is an idea, an image, a warning encoded inside a story that has survived for thousands of years. Atlantis first appears in the dialogues of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. He describes a powerful seafaring civilization that existed long before his time, rich, technologically advanced, and convinced of its own exceptional destiny. The Atlanteans controlled vast territories, possessed enormous resources, built magnificent cities, and believed themselves chosen. Their society was orderly, strong, and in their own eyes, invincible. And this is where the unsettling part begins. Plato makes it clear, the fall of Atlantis was not random. It was not merely an earthquake or a flood. It was a punishment for arrogance, for abusing knowledge and power, for losing a sense of measure. The Atlanteans ceased to be worthy of the order they had created. And in a single night, in a single day, their world sank beneath the waves. It is important to understand, Plato was not writing a chronicle. He was writing philosophy. Atlantis for him was not geography, it was a model. An ideal state pushed all the way to self-destruction. A civilization that believed its laws were above nature and its power above morality. And yet the myth proved too powerful to remain only an allegory. For more than 2,000 years, people have searched for Atlantis. In the Atlantic Ocean, in the Mediterranean, near Africa, in the Caribbean, even in Antarctica. Every strange underwater formation, every ancient ruin has been seen as possible proof because humanity desperately wants Atlantis to be real. Why? Because a real Atlantis would mean that even the most advanced civilizations can disappear completely, without trace, without heirs, without continuation. That idea is terrifying and strangely magnetic. It challenges the belief that progress always moves forward. But even if Atlantis never existed as a physical place, it absolutely exists as a cultural fact, as an archetype, as the image of a civilization that crossed an invisible line between development and self-destruction. And in this sense, Atlantis is deeply modern. Every generation reads the myth differently. For some, it is a story of lost technologies. For others, divine punishment. For others still, the cycles of history. But almost always, at the center, is the same thing. A civilization's confidence in its own invulnerability and the sudden collapse of that confidence. Atlantis is not really a question of whether it existed or not. It is a question of what happens when a civilization believes it is eternal. That is why this myth has lived longer than many real empires. It does not need ruins. It works at the level of meaning. And now, after Atlantis, we move from myth to a reality that was no less astonishing. A city that truly existed, truly stood at the center of the world, and truly became a symbol of human pride, not in philosophy, but in stone, law, and memory. Ahead of us lies Babylon. Chapter 12. Babylon, the megacity of the ancient world. In human history, there were capital cities, temple cities, fortress cities. And then there was Babylon, a city that believed itself to be the center of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. Here trade routes met, languages, religions, laws. Here the fates of peoples were decided. And here, for the first time, a city became not just a place to live, but a force in itself, capable of shaping how people thought. Babylon rose in the valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, a land where nature itself demanded precise calculation and collective effort. Irrigation canals, dams, granaries, all of this turned chaotic water into a controlled resource. And whoever controlled the water controlled life. This is where the city stopped being a settlement and became a complex organism. Unlike many ancient centers, Babylon did not grow around a single palace or a single temple. It expanded. It absorbed people, ideas, cultures. It was a true megacity of its time, noisy, crowded, multilingual. Merchants from distant lands, priests of different gods, soldiers, craftsmen, scribes, all moved through its streets. The city never slept. Law held a special place in Babylon. Here, under King Hammurabi, one of the earliest known legal codes was created. These laws governed not only crime and punishment, but everyday life, trade, marriage, inheritance, responsibility for mistakes. For the first time, order was written down and made binding for all. The city began to live by text. But with law came tension. Babylon was a city of sharp contrasts. Wealthy quarters stood beside slums, luxury next to poverty. Order existed, but it was strict. The law protected the system more than it protected the individual, and that made the city both stable and fragile. Religiously, Babylon was just as complex. Its chief god was Marduk, the god of order, the conqueror of chaos. It is symbolic that this god ruled over a city that sought to organize the world around it. The great ziggurat, Edamananki, a massive step tower, became a symbol of the link between heaven and earth. It would later be remembered as the Tower of Babel. Babylon's image quickly grew beyond reality. For some peoples, it became a symbol of greatness and power. For others, a symbol of corruption, pride, and moral decay. In religious texts, Babylon turned into a metaphor, the sinful city that must inevitably fall. And the real city did fall, not all at once, not in a single moment. Babylon endured conquests, rebellions, changes of dynasties. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks. Each new ruler tried to make the city their own. But slowly, its importance faded. Trade routes shifted. Political centers moved. The city that had once been everything became just one place among many. By the time Babylon was finally abandoned, it was already living more in memory than in reality. Its image outlived its walls. It survived in myths, in religious texts, in philosophy, as a warning that even the greatest city can become a symbol of its own downfall. Babylon shows us that a civilization can be immensely powerful and still fragile. That concentrating power, resources, and people creates greatness, and at the same time increases risk. A city that gathers everything in one place depends on the stability of the entire system. After Babylon, one thing becomes clear. Scale is not a guarantee of eternity. Sometimes it only speeds up the end. And the next story leads us to another center of the ancient world, a city of knowledge and archives, which fell precisely when it reached its intellectual peak. Ahead lies Nineveh. Chapter 13, Nineveh. Knowledge before the fall. Unlike Babylon, which stunned with its size and noise, Nineveh was a city of memory. A city where power sought not only to control the present, but to collect the past in all its forms. Here, civilization attempted to archive itself, as if sensing that one day it might no longer exist. Nineveh became the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the height of its power. It was a city of empire, built on war, discipline, and fear. The Assyrians did not hide their brutality, and the story of what that meant is about to unfold slowly, like distant thunder across time. Nineveh, the city that tried to save time, on the contrary. The Assyrians did not hide their brutality. They turned it into a tool of politics. Stone reliefs showing executions, sieges, and deportations were meant to spread terror before resistance even began. Fear was their first line of defense. And yet, behind this harsh and intimidating shell, something completely unexpected was growing. Nineveh was not only a military capital, it was also the intellectual heart of the ancient world. Here, King Ashurbanipal created one of the first systematically organized libraries in human history. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets were gathered from across the empire, written in different languages, copied from distant lands, carried from conquered cities. Myths, laws, medical treatises, astronomical observations, dictionaries, hymns, and epics. The Assyrians were not merely collecting knowledge. They were trying to preserve everything humanity had ever known before them. In these archives, the story of the Great Flood was recorded long before the biblical version was written. Here were fixed the movements of the planets, methods of healing diseases, magical formulas, and incantations. It was an attempt to stop time itself, to lock culture inside tablets of clay, the most durable material available to people of that age. The city kept growing stronger. Nineveh rose behind massive walls. Aqueducts brought water from far away. Parks and gardens displayed human control over nature. Everything seemed planned. Everything seemed prepared. And yet, this very perfection became its weakness. The Assyrian Empire was too centralized, too rigid, too dependent on fear and constant expansion. As long as new lands were conquered, the system held. But when expansion slowed, the cracks began to appear. The subjected peoples were waiting, and eventually their moment came. At the end of the 7th century BCE, a coalition of former vassals rose against Nineveh. The siege was merciless. The city fell. The capital that had seemed invincible was destroyed so completely that for centuries it vanished from human memory. Its location was forgotten. And here lies the paradox. The city that tried to preserve all the knowledge of the world was itself erased almost without a trace. If not for the library, sealed in clay and buried under ruins, we would know far less about Assyria today. Fire destroys papyrus and wood, but it only bakes clay, making it even stronger. What was meant to disappear survived by accident. Nineveh teaches us how fragile cultural centers truly are. Knowledge does not protect a city from collapse. Archives do not stop armies. Intellectual brilliance can exist side by side with political suicide. A civilization can reach the peak of awareness and fall in the very same moment. And yet, Nineveh did not vanish completely. It continued to live in texts, in myths, in ideas that outlasted its walls. Perhaps this is the true form of survival for civilizations, not in stone, not in cities, but in the transmission of meaning. After Nineveh, we encounter a different kind of disappearance. Not destruction by swords, not simple forgetting, but the end of an entire age. A technological shift that changed the world and buried the old order, along with those who could not adapt. Ahead lies the story of the Hittites. Chapter 14. The Hittites, iron, and the end of an era. Sometimes civilizations do not vanish because they are weak, but because the world around them changes too fast. The Hittites found themselves in exactly this position. They were not a forgotten people on the margins of history. On the contrary, they were one of the great powers of their time, a rival of Egypt and Babylon, rulers of vast territories in Anatolia and the Near East. And yet, their disappearance became a symbol of the end of an entire epoch. The Hittite kingdom formed in Anatolia in the 2nd millennium BCE. It was a world of fortresses, roads, treaties, and armies. The Hittites were the first to do something that would forever change the balance of power. They began to use iron not as a rare ritual metal, but as a material for weapons and tools. Iron was stronger than bronze, more accessible, and in the long run, revolutionary. That is why the Hittites are sometimes called the destroyers of the Bronze Age. Their state was rigidly organized. A king was military commander and supreme judge. A developed bureaucracy, written diplomacy. One of the earliest known international peace treaties was signed between the Hittites and Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh. This was a world that knew how to fight and how to negotiate. Hittite cities were protected by massive walls. Their gates were decorated with stone lions and sphinx. Archives stored thousands of tablets, laws, myths, treaties. Their pantheon was enormous. They eagerly adopted the gods of conquered peoples, creating a complex and multi-layered religious system. It was a civilization, confident in itself, deeply embedded in the international order of its time. But that very system began to collapse. The end of the second millennium BC brought a vast crisis. Trade routes broke, cities burned. Entire states vanished almost at once. Mycenae, Ugarit, many centers of the eastern Mediterranean. Historians call this period the Bronze Age collapse. And the Hittites stood at its very center. The causes were complex. Climate change, drought, famine, internal conflicts. Pressure from the so-called Sea Peoples. A world dependent on international trade and bronze proved too fragile. When supply chains collapsed, a familiar order fell with them. Paradoxically, the Hittites may have become victims of their own technological advantage. Iron slowly moved beyond the elite, changing the nature of war and breaking the old balance of power. States that once controlled resources lost their monopoly. The world became more chaotic and harder to govern. At some point, the Hittite capital was abandoned, cities emptied. Central authority disappeared. The people were not destroyed. The Hittites dissolved into other cultures, leaving behind texts, laws, and traces of influence. But as a civilization, they ceased to exist. Their disappearance is not just the fall of one state, it is a threshold. After the Hittites, the world became different, less connected, more fragmented. An age began in which iron became ordinary, and the great empires of the Bronze Age faded into memory. The Hittites remind us that a civilization can die not from backwardness, but from transition. When the rules of the game change too fast, even the strongest may not be ready. Sometimes history does not punish mistakes. It simply changes the era. Chapter 15, Nubia, the Kingdom of the Black Pharaohs. For a long time, the story of Nubia existed on the margins of textbooks. It was mentioned only briefly as Egypt's southern neighbor, a source of gold, slaves, or mercenaries. But one day, the roles reversed. And then it became clear. Nubia was not a shadow of a great civilization. It was a world of its own. One that not only survived beside Egypt, but for a time ruled over it. The Nubian civilization formed south of Egypt, in what is now Sudan, along the Nile. This was a land where the river did more than give life. It connected cultures, trade, and power. The Nubians controlled the vital routes between Central Africa and the Mediterranean. Through their lands flowed gold, ivory, and rare woods. Economic strength here did not come from conquest, but from position. Over time, the Kingdom of Kush emerged, a powerful state with its own elite, religion, and architecture. The Kushites even built their own pyramids, different from Egypt's, steeper, more compact, and far more numerous. There were hundreds of them, softly rising from the desert, like quiet echoes of a civilization that refused to remain in anyone's shadow. Nubia, the civilization that dissolved. This tells us that the cult of the afterlife and of divine authority was no less important here than it was in Egypt. And the most unexpected turning point came in the 7th century BCE. At a time when Egypt was weakened by internal conflict and division, the Nubian rulers moved north. And they won. Thus was born the 25th dynasty of Egypt, the age of the so-called Black Pharaohs. And here history turns in a strange way. The Nubian kings did not destroy Egypt. They restored it. They revived the ancient cults, supported the priesthood, rebuilt the temples, and tried to return the lost greatness of the past. The conquerors became the guardians of memory. This is one of the rarest moments in history, when power arrives not to erase, but to preserve. Yet this rule was fragile. Egypt remained restless. Assyria pressed from the north. The pressure grew. In the end, the Nubian pharaohs were forced back to the south. Egypt once again became a foreign land. But Nubia did not vanish. It lived on for centuries as an independent kingdom. And still, slowly, its influence began to fade. Trade routes shifted. Resources passed into Egyptian hands. External pressure and assimilation did their quiet work. Nubian culture did not die in fire. It dissolved. Language, religion, the elite, all of it slowly blended into neighboring worlds. Nubia shows us a special kind of disappearance, not collapse, not conquest, but the loss of uniqueness. When a society keeps living, but stops being itself, the people remain. The name fades, and perhaps this is the quietest way to disappear. Not destruction, but forgetting. Chapter 16, Axum. A forgotten world power, there are civilizations that vanished so long ago, they feel like myth. And there are those that disappeared recently, and therefore feel strangely close. Axum belongs to the second kind. Once it was named one of the 4 great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Merchants knew it, diplomats, kings. Today, its name is barely spoken. Axum rose in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, where the trade routes of Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean met. It was a perfect place for a state that chose exchange over conquest. Through Axum flowed gold, ivory, incense, spices, and exotic animals. Its ports on the Red Sea linked Africa to India and to the Roman world. Wealth here came not from the battlefield, but from the market. Axum minted its own coins, a sign of economic maturity and trust in the state. Its name traveled the world in metal. It also had its own writing system, an alphabet still used in Ethiopia today. A rare continuity, where a vanished civilization still speaks through living letters. In the 4th century CE, Axum made a decisive choice. It adopted Christianity before most of the world. This was not only faith, it was power. It tied Axum to Byzantium, strengthened royal authority, and created a new identity. Legends grew here. The Queen of Sheba, the Ark of the Covenant. Historians may doubt, but legends always gather around greatness. And yet, this empire did not fall in flames. It faded. Trade routes shifted. Soil grew poor. The sea was lost. An empire tied to global exchange became fragile when those connections broke. Axum shrank, from world power to regional kingdom, from kingdom to memory. A disappearance without collapse, without invasion, without ruins. The civilization lived on, but it was no longer the center. Chapter 17, Konar Sandal, the temple civilization of Iran. Sometimes archaeology does not find a city, or a people, but a sentence that was never finished. Konar Sandal is such a case. In southern Iran, a place long thought to be a periphery, a vast temple complex was uncovered in the 21st century. Terraces, a ziggurat, administrative halls. This was not a village. It was a center of power. Konar Sandal was built as a capital, or as a sacred heart of a civilization. Decisions were made here. Rituals were performed. Knowledge was stored. And the strangest discovery, writing. Symbols were found that do not match Sumerian cuneiform, or any known script. If it truly is writing, it may be one of the oldest in the world, but it cannot be read. The symbols remain. The voices are gone. Some scholars linked Konar Sandal to the legendary land of Arata, a rich, advanced rival of Mesopotamia, described in Sumerian texts. If this is true, then this was not an edge of civilization, but another center. And yet this story ends. No sign of great conquest. No obvious disaster. Perhaps climate. Perhaps trade. Perhaps competition. The civilization vanished before it could tell its own story. And that is its deepest tragedy. Not destruction, but silence. Konar Sandal, when history loses its voice looting, illegal excavations, the loss of context. We did not only lose objects, we lost meaning. Perhaps here were stored texts that could have radically changed our understanding of the earliest history of civilization. Konar Sandal reminds us that the past is not guaranteed. It can disappear twice, first together with the civilization, and then together with its traces. And when that happens, history becomes a guess. This was a civilization that may have known far more about itself than we will ever know. It built temples. It used writing. It organized power. And almost all of it has vanished without a trace, as if someone turned off the light before the story could be written down. After Konar Sandal, it becomes painfully clear. Our picture of the ancient world is incomplete. There are far more missing pages than we realize. And now we move toward a civilization that did the opposite. It left too many signs, but no key to read them. Ahead lies Vinca. Chapter 18, Vinca. The writing no one read. Sometimes a civilization leaves ruins. Sometimes it leaves myths. And sometimes it leaves signs. Many signs, but not a single key. The Vinca culture is one of the most haunting examples of this kind of silence. Because perhaps this was one of humanity's earliest attempts to speak to the future, and the future never learned how to listen. Vinca existed in Europe thousands of years before the Sumerians and Egyptians on the lands of today's Balkans. For a long time, this period was thought to be primitive, but archaeology quietly disagreed. Vinca settlements were large, dense, and organized. Some held thousands of people. By the standards of their time, they were proto-cities. The people of Vinca farmed, traded, crafted. They made delicate ceramics covered with intricate patterns. They used copper tools long before metal became common. Their lives were not crude. They were stable, thoughtful, almost elegant. But the true mystery was not in their homes. It was in their symbols. On pottery, figurines, and tablets, archaeologists found hundreds of signs. Repeated, combined, arranged. These are not decorations. They are too structured, too deliberate. This is not ornament. This is a message. Everything suggests that this may be one of the earliest sign systems in the world, perhaps even a form of writing. If so, the story of writing does not begin in Mesopotamia, but in Europe, much earlier than we ever imagined. And then, silence. We cannot read these signs. We do not know what they meant. Were they the language of gods? Economic records? Ritual formulas? Names? A sacred code? Without bilingual texts? Without continuity? Without later sources? Everything remains speculation. And then Vinca disappears. Not by invasion. Not by fire. The settlements slowly decline. People leave. The symbols are no longer used. If this was writing, it did not survive its own culture. The knowledge vanished with its keepers. This is one of the most painful moments in the history of civilizations. Not just the fall of a society, but the loss of information that could have changed everything we know about the past. Vinca reminds us that progress is not a straight line. Knowledge can appear and vanish. Writing does not guarantee immortality if no one is left to read it. When we look at these symbols today, it feels as if someone thousands of years ago tried to say something important, clearly, but not long enough. Chapter 19, Cucutini Tripilia, the cities that were burned. Some civilizations disappear suddenly. Some fade slowly, and some destroy themselves again and again, deliberately, ritually, without violence. Cucutini Tripilia is one of the strangest and most underestimated cultures of the ancient world. It existed in what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania thousands of years BCE. While much of Europe was still scattered in small villages, the Tripilians built enormous cities. Some were as large as the early centers of Mesopotamia. Thousands of houses, planned streets, squares, economic zones. These were not villages. They were proto-metropolises. Their homes were built of wood and clay, often 2 stories high, with ovens, paintings, carefully designed interiors. They farmed. They crafted. They traded. Their pottery is among the most beautiful in Neolithic Europe. Spirals, symbols, patterns passed down for generations. And then, something extraordinary. Every few decades, sometimes once a generation, sometimes two, the people abandoned their cities and burned them to the ground. Not one house, the entire city. The fires were so intense that the clay walls turned almost into ceramic. Sometimes a new city rose on the ashes. Sometimes the people moved elsewhere. What matters is what we do not find. No signs of invasion, no weapons, no mass graves. This was not war, not disaster. This was done by the people themselves. Why? Perhaps it was a ritual of renewal. The house was seen as a living being whose life must end in fire. Perhaps it was sanitation, fighting parasites, disease, and exhausted soil. Perhaps it was social balance, cities growing too large, becoming unstable. Whatever the reason, one thing is clear. They did not believe a city should last forever. Stability was not in preservation, but in letting go. They valued life more than walls. And yet, even this civilization eventually faded. Cities grew smaller, patterns simplified, people blended into other cultures. No final fire, just one cycle that did not begin again. Cucutini Tripilia challenges our idea of progress. We believe development means accumulation, more buildings, more permanence. But here we see another logic, a civilization that survived because it was willing to start over. And perhaps that was also its limit. In the age of metal and war, a culture built on cycles became fragile. It was not destroyed, it dissolved, giving way to other forms of life. The Tripilians remind us that not all civilizations sought eternity. Some lived in rhythm, like breathing, like the turning of the seasons. And when that rhythm was broken, history simply moved on. Ahead of us now lies a civilization that received almost no place in popular history, even though it stood at the very origins of agriculture and medicine in Asia. Next, Mehrgar. Chapter 20, Mehrgar, the forgotten beginning of Asia. Mehrgar is one of those places that rarely appears in popular stories about the ancient world. And yet without it, that story would look very different. It was located in what is now Pakistan, at the foot of the Bolan Mountains, on a natural crossroads between the Iranian Plateau and the Indus Valley. The settlement already existed in the 9th millennium BCE, long before cities, states, and writing appeared in South Asia. Excavations show that Mehrgar was one of the earliest centers of agriculture in the region. Its people grew wheat and barley, raised goats and cattle. This was not an experiment. It was a stable, lasting way of life that endured for centuries. They built houses from mud brick, created grain storage rooms, organized their village to support a growing population. Over time, Mehrgar became more complex. Specialized craftsmen appeared. Archaeologists have found beads made of lapis lazuli, shells, and semi-precious stones, evidence of trade with distant lands, as far as Afghanistan and the shores of the Indian Ocean. This was not an isolated village. It was part of a wide network of exchange long before famous trading civilizations existed. One of the most astonishing discoveries is evidence of early medicine. In burials, skulls were found with carefully drilled teeth, signs of dental procedures performed while people were alive. This means practical medical knowledge was already being passed down inside the community. For such an early time, this is extraordinary. Mehrgar existed for several thousand years, gradually changing. Archaeologists identify multiple phases, from an early Neolithic village to a more complex society with developed crafts. But by the end of the 4th millennium BCE, the settlement begins to lose its importance. People slowly leave. They move elsewhere. Mehrgar was not destroyed. There are no signs of war, no mass violence, no sudden collapse. Its role simply changed. New centers emerged in the Indus Valley, or one of the great civilizations of the ancient world would soon arise. The people of Mehrgar likely became part of that story, melting into larger and more complex societies. Mehrgar shows us the earliest foundations of civilization in Asia. Here, farming, craft, trade, and social specialization first took stable form. It was not yet a civilization of palaces and kings, but it was the soil from which those worlds would grow. Mehrgar disappeared quietly, but places like this reveal how humanity moved from small villages to complex societies. Without it, the story of the Indus Valley would feel incomplete. Ahead lies a civilization that united vast regions of South America not with armies, but with faith and shared ritual. Next, Chavin. Chapter 21. Chavin, Religion as a Bond. The Chavin civilization arose in the Andes of what is now Peru around 1000 BCE. For several centuries it became a cultural center whose influence spread across enormous distances. It was not an empire. There was no conquering army, no single ruler, no great wars. And yet its ideas traveled everywhere. The heart of Chavin was the ritual center of Chavin de Huantar, high in the mountains, where ecological zones met, coast, jungle, and highlands. This was not accidental. It became a place where different peoples, languages, and traditions came together, not through politics, but through belief. Even today, its architecture feels powerful. Stone platforms, underground galleries, narrow corridors, air shafts that carry sound and wind. This was not just a temple. It was a carefully designed ritual machine. Inside were stone carvings of hybrid beings, part human, part jaguar, part serpent, part bird of prey. These images appear on ceramics, textiles, and jewelry across wide regions, all linked to Chavin. The priests held power, not military, but sacred. Chavin religion was built on mystery, fear, and transformation. Hallucinogenic plants were likely used. Water echoed through stone tunnels. Darkness, tight spaces, and sudden divine images created overwhelming experiences. People left these rituals changed, carrying a new vision of the world. Chavin did not erase local cultures. It blended with them. Objects in Chavin style are found hundreds of kilometers away in places where no Chavin settlements existed. Its influence spread through pilgrimage, trade, and spiritual authority, not violence. Its economy was practical. Exchange between ecological zones, craft production, high-quality ceramics, and stonework. Chavin controlled meaning, and in the ancient world, meaning could be stronger than weapons. By the 2nd century BCE, its influence fades. The ritual center loses importance. Why is unclear. Trade routes shifted. New religious centers emerged. Sacred authority changed. Chavin was not destroyed. It simply stopped being the center. Its ideas lived on inside later. Andean cultures. It vanished as a hub, but not as a source. Chavin shows us it's a rare form of unity without conquest. But when a shared symbol no longer means the same thing to everyone, the bond breaks. Ahead lies a culture that left almost no monuments of power, yet stands at the very beginning of American history. Next, Clovis. Chapter 22. Clovis, the first Americans. The story of Clovis begins with a discovery that first seemed ordinary and then changed everything. In the early 20th century, archaeologists in North America found a special kind of stone spear point, thin, elegant, symmetrical, with a long central groove. These quiet pieces of stone would soon tell one of the deepest stories of human arrival in the New World. Mehrgar, the forgotten beginning of Asia, in an age of metal and war, the culture of cycles proved fragile. It did not die. It dissolved, quietly giving way to other forms of life. The people of Tripilia remind us that not every civilization sought eternity. Some lived in rhythm, like breathing, like the turning of the seasons. And when that rhythm was broken, history simply moved on. And now, ahead of us, we meet a civilization that almost disappeared from history, despite standing at the very roots of agriculture and medicine in Asia. Megar, Chapter 20. Megar, the forgotten beginning of Asia. Megar is one of those places that rarely appears in popular stories of the ancient world. Yet without it, the story itself would look very different. It was located in what is now Pakistan, at the foothills of the Bolan Mountains, at a natural crossroads between the Iranian Plateau and the Indus Valley. The settlement already existed in the 9th millennium BCE, long before cities, states, or writing appeared in South Asia. Archaeological excavations show that Megar was one of the earliest centers of agriculture in the region. Its people cultivated wheat and barley, raised goats and cattle. This was not a temporary experiment. It was a stable, sustainable way of life that lasted for centuries. They built homes from sun-dried bricks, constructed granaries, and organized their settlement in a way that could support a growing population. Over time, Megar became more complex. Specialized craftsmen appeared. Archaeologists have found beads made of lapis lazuli, shells, and semi-precious stones, evidence of long-distance trade reaching Afghanistan and even the shores of the Indian Ocean. This means Megar was never isolated. It was part of a wide network of exchange long before famous trading civilizations emerged. One of the most astonishing discoveries was evidence of early medicine. In the graves, archaeologists found skulls with carefully drilled teeth, signs of dental procedures performed during a person's lifetime. This reveals practical medical knowledge passed down within the community. For such an early period, this is extremely rare and a powerful sign of social organization and shared learning. Megar existed for several thousand years, slowly evolving. Archaeologists identify multiple phases, from an early Neolithic village to a more complex society with developed crafts. Yet by the end of the 4th millennium BCE, the settlement began to lose its importance. People gradually left, moving to other regions. What is important is this: Megar was not destroyed by war or catastrophe. There are no signs of mass violence or sudden collapse. Its role simply changed. New centers began to rise in the Indus Valley, where one of the greatest ancient civilizations would later form. The people of Megar most likely became part of that process, dissolving into larger and more complex societies. The historical value of Megar lies in this: it shows us the earliest foundations of civilization in Asia. Here, for the first time in the region, stable agriculture, crafts, trade, and social specialization emerged. It was not yet a civilization in the usual sense. No cities, no palaces, no kings. But it was the ground upon which all later cultures were built. Megar faded quietly into the past. Yet places like this allow us to understand how humanity moved from small villages to complex worlds. Without it, the history of the Indus Valley would be fragmented, incomplete. And now we move forward toward a civilization that united vast regions of South America, not by weapons, but by belief and ritual. Chavin, Religion as Unity, Chapter 21. The Yavin civilization arose in the Andes of modern Peru around 1000 BCE, and for several centuries became a powerful cultural center, its influence spreading across enormous distances. This was not an empire of armies and conquest. There was no capital in the usual sense, no single ruler, no evidence of large-scale wars. And yet, its ideas reached far and wide. The heart of this civilization was the ritual center of Chavin de Huantar, located high in the mountains, at the meeting point of different natural regions. Paths from the coast, the jungle, and the highlands all converged here. This was no accident. Chavin became a meeting place of peoples, languages, and traditions, united not by politics, but by faith. Its architecture is breathtaking even today. Stone platforms, narrow corridors, underground galleries, hidden ventilation shafts. This was not merely a temple. It was a carefully designed ritual machine. Inside stood stone stelae carved with images of gods, hybrid beings with the features of humans, jaguars, serpents, and birds of prey. These same images appear on ceramics, textiles, and ornaments throughout the regions connected to Chavin. Priests held the real power, not military power, but sacred authority. Chavin religion was built on mystery, fear, and transformation. Hallucinogenic plants were likely used in rituals. The sound of water echoing through stone corridors, the darkness, the tight spaces, the sudden appearance of divine images. All of this created a powerful psychological experience. People emerged changed, carrying a new vision of the world inside them. Chavin did not destroy local cultures. Instead, its symbols blended into existing traditions. Chavin-style objects are found hundreds of kilometers from the center, even in places where no Chavin settlements ever existed. This shows influence spread through pilgrimage, trade, and spiritual authority, not through force. Chavin controlled not resources, but meaning. And in the ancient world, meaning was often stronger than weapons. By the 2nd century BCE, its influence began to fade. The ritual center slowly lost importance. Why remains unclear. Trade routes may have shifted. New religious centers may have arisen. Or perhaps the sacred system itself stopped speaking to everyone in the same way. Chavin was not destroyed. It simply stopped being the center. Its symbols lived on in later Andean cultures. It disappeared as a hub, but not as a source. And now we move on to a culture that left behind almost no symbols of power, yet may have been the first in the Americas. Clovis, The First Americans, Chapter 22. The story of Clovis began with a single discovery, one that seemed accidental, but changed our understanding of an entire continent. In the early 20th century, archaeologists found a distinctive type of stone spear point, thin, symmetrical, with a characteristic groove along its length. These tools were so recognizable that they gave their name to an entire culture. The Clovis people lived about 13,000 years ago. At the end of the last ice age, North America was still a land of giants. Mammoths, mastodons, ancient bison, giant sloths roamed the plains. And the Clovis were hunters of this megafauna. Their technology was astonishingly precise. Their stone points were made from carefully chosen materials, often transported hundreds of kilometers. This reveals a highly mobile people, moving across vast landscapes. These weapons were mounted on spears and used to hunt massive animals, a dangerous, coordinated, and organized task. For a long time, Clovis was believed to represent the first humans in the Americas. The classic theory said they crossed from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge and spread rapidly across the continent. And indeed, their sites stretched from Canada to Mexico in a remarkably short time. But later discoveries complicated the picture. Older sites were found, suggesting Clovis was not the beginning, but one powerful wave among others. Still, Clovis was perfectly adapted to its world. But the world changed. The climate warmed. Ice retreated. The great animals disappeared. Mammoths and mastodons went extinct, whether from climate, hunting, or both. For Clovis, this was a blow to the very foundation of life. Their tools changed, their strategies shifted, and the classic Clovis culture faded. The people did not vanish, only the way of life did. And so humanity moved on. The Nabateans, masters of the desert, these routes connected Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Roman world. The Nabateans did not simply escort caravans, they controlled the entire system of trade. The heart of their kingdom was the city of Petra. It was carved directly into rose-colored cliffs inside a narrow canyon, almost invisible from a distance. This made the city naturally protected. But Petra's greatest miracle was not its architecture. It was water. In a land where rain was rare and unpredictable, the Nabateans built a complex system of collection, storage, and distribution, channels, cisterns, dams. They captured every drop and guided it exactly where it was needed. Because of this, Petra could support a large population, lush gardens, skilled craftsmen, and a thriving marketplace. The city was not merely a caravan stop. It was a full administrative and economic capital. Coins were minted here. Deals were made. Goods were stored and exchanged. The Nabateans gradually adopted elements of Greek and Roman culture, yet they preserved their own language, religion, and traditions. They did not seek conquest. They preferred negotiation. They paid, traded, and formed alliances. Even with Rome, they maintained long-standing partnerships. The Romans valued stable trade and saw no reason to destroy a system that worked. But the world was changing. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, trade routes began to shift. Sea routes grew more important, faster and cheaper for moving goods from Arabia and India. Caravan trade slowly lost its central role. The economic foundation of the Nabatean kingdom began to weaken. In the early 2nd century CE, Rome officially absorbed Nabatea into the empire. It happened relatively peacefully. There were no mass destructions, no great massacres. Petra continued to exist, but now as a provincial city. Control over trade passed into Roman hands. Over time, decline followed. Earthquakes damaged the water systems. Trade bypassed the region. The population fell. By late antiquity, Petra had lost its importance and was almost completely abandoned. People left behind carved facades and brilliant engineering, systems no one remained to maintain. Yet the Nabateans did not vanish overnight. They were not destroyed. They dissolved into larger worlds, Romang, Byzantine, and later Arab. Languages changed, religions changed. The caravan cities lost their purpose. Only the legacy remained. The story of the Nabateans shows a civilization built entirely on economic role. While the world needed caravan trade, they thrived. When global exchange changed, their system became unnecessary. No walls, no engineering could replace a lost place in the world's network. And now we arrive at the final great chapter of this journey, a megacity of North America, as vast as the cities of the Old World, yet abandoned long before Europeans arrived. Cahokia, the megacity of North America, Chapter 25. Cahokia was the largest urban center of pre-Columbian North America. It stood in the Mississippi River Valley, near the meeting point of several great rivers in what is now Illinois. This location provided easy transportation and access to rich agricultural lands. The city emerged around the 1st century CE and reached its peak between the 11th and 13th centuries. At its height, Cahokia was home to between 10,000 and 20,000 people, one of the most populated cities in the world at that time, and the largest north of Mexico. It became the heart of the Mississippian culture, a complex society of farmers, craftsmen, and priests, united by shared religion and political order. The city was carefully organized. At its center stood a vast earthwork complex of more than 100 mounds. The largest of them, Monk's Mound, was a massive stepped platform over 30 meters high, with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its summit likely stood the ruler's residence, or the main sacred structure. Around this core lay residential districts, workshops, and ritual plazas. Some areas were surrounded by wooden palisades, suggesting social hierarchy and the need for control. Archaeology shows clear social divisions. Elites lived closer to the central mounds. Farmers lived farther out. Cahokia's economy was built on intensive agriculture. Maize was the main crop, allowing the city to support a vast population. Food surpluses sustained craftsmen, priests, and rulers. Pottery, stone tools, and copper ornaments were produced. Copper came from the Great Lakes, evidence of long-distance trade. Religion was central. Cahokia was a major ritual center, linked to the sun, fertility, and ancestors. The city had a wood henge, a circle of wooden posts used to track the movement of the sun and mark important calendar dates. These observations guided both farming and ceremony. But by the late 10th century, change began. Population declined. Mound construction stopped. Whole districts were abandoned. Evidence points to overcrowding, polluted water, disease, and malnutrition. Skeletons show rising stress and mortality. Climate shifts and internal conflict likely made things worse. A centralized system that once worked became fragile when conditions deteriorated. By the 14th century, Cahokia was empty. Its people left in organized waves, settling elsewhere in the Mississippi Valley. When Europeans arrived, only grassy mounds remained, mistaken for natural hills. Only later did the truth emerge. Beneath them lay one of the greatest cities of ancient North America, Nazca. The drawings seen only from the sky, chapter 26. The Nazca civilization lived on the southern coast of modern Peru from around the 1st century BCE to the 6th century CE. This was one of the harshest environments on Earth, one of the driest deserts in the world. Rain was rare. Soil was poor. Survival depended entirely on water. In these conditions, the Nazca created one of the most mysterious cultures in history. They did not build great cities or towering pyramids. Their settlements were small, clustered along rivers and oases. Their economy was based on farming. They grew maize, beans, squash, and cotton. And here, in this silent desert, their greatest mystery was about to take shape. To bring water to their fields, the Nazca created a complex system of underground canals called puquios. These remarkable engineering structures allowed groundwater to be brought to the surface, providing stable irrigation even during years of drought. Some of these channels are still used by local communities today, quietly, faithfully, across thousands of years. Nazca society was organized around religious and ritual centers. The most important of these was Kawachi, a vast complex of platforms, plazas, and temple buildings made of clay and stone. It was not a city in the usual sense, but a sacred place of pilgrimage, where rituals, festivals, and ceremonies connected to fertility, water, and the sky were held. People gathered here periodically, but they did not live there permanently. The most famous legacy of the Nazca are their giant geoglyphs etched across the desert floor. These lines form thousands of straight paths, trapezoids, and enormous figures of animals, birds, fish, and human-like beings. Some stretch for hundreds of meters. They were created by removing the dark surface stones, revealing the lighter soil beneath. Thanks to the dry desert climate, these drawings have survived for thousands of years. It is important to understand that the Nazca had no way to see these figures from the sky as we do today. This rules out the idea of them being messages meant to be viewed from above. Instead, archaeological evidence shows that the lines were part of a ritual landscape. People walked along them during ceremonies, processions, and sacred journeys, appealing to the gods of water and the heavens. The animal figures likely symbolized forces of nature and mythological beings woven into their spiritual world. The Nazca also left behind a rich artistic heritage. Their pottery is among the most expressive in the ancient Andes. Bright colors, intricate patterns, images of gods, priests, and fantastic creatures. Unlike the geoglyphs, this pottery gives us a clearer window into their mythology and beliefs. Around the 6th or 7th century CE, Nazca culture began to decline. Archaeological evidence points to severe climate shifts, long droughts, followed by destructive floods. These changes weakened the agricultural foundation of society. The irrigation system struggled. The ritual centers lost their meaning. The Nazca were not conquered, nor destroyed by a single catastrophe. Their culture slowly transformed and was absorbed into later Andean societies, including the Wari. The people remained, but the rituals, the art, and the sacred landscape faded. Nazca shows us a different path of civilization. Without cities, without writing, without empires, they built a stable economy, a complex spiritual system, and one of the largest symbolic projects in human history. Their lines are not mysteries for mystery's sake. They are traces of a people trying to survive and negotiate with nature in one of the harshest places on Earth. And now, as our journey draws to a close, we can see how many different paths ancient civilizations took. They rose in mountains, deserts, jungles, and river valleys. Some built in stone, others in clay or wood. Some wrote, others spoke through symbols, rituals, and memory. Yet all faced the same quiet challenges: food, water, social order, and balance with their environment. We have learned that civilizations rarely disappeared suddenly. More often, it was slow change: droughts, floods, soil exhaustion, overcrowding, shifting trade routes, social tension. Sometimes one factor, sometimes many together. And many civilizations did not truly die. Mergar became part of the Indus world. The ancestral Poblones became today's Pueblo peoples. The Nabateans became Ramang, then Byzantine, then Arab. Nazca and Shavan became part of later Andean cultures. Cities vanished. People remained. Archaeology shows us that complexity does not guarantee survival. Peaceful societies disappeared, just as warrior states did. It was not failure. It was the meeting of nature, economy, and human choice. Even today, the ancient world is still incomplete. Some cultures we know only through ruins, others through symbols we can no longer fully read. And each new discovery quietly reshapes our understanding. Ancient civilizations were not primitive. They were adaptive, intelligent, and creative. They found ways to live, build, and survive in their own worlds. And now, let your thoughts soften. The day is over. The stories have been told. Let them drift away, like ancient cities slowly sinking beneath the sand of time. Good night.